Well, welcome everybody. This is the first time we've had a masked Berg, and everybody seems to be comfortable with it. I'm not entirely comfortable with it, but nonetheless, I'll survive. But in any event, welcome to the first in-person Ferg of the 2021 year. It's a pleasure to have it get going again. I missed it. Doing it on Zoom is not the same thing, but nonetheless, we have to roll with the punches or something like that. In any event, we have a wonderful guest today who is going to receive a wonderful introduction by Berkeley Yorkery, who is the Director of Science for the Center on Children and Family Policy here in the center at Duke, in the Sanford School. And I didn't get a chance to ask her. I was going to ask her if her parents deliberately rhymed.
I got married into that last name and didn't realize until I changed my name what a tongue twister it was.
Well, it's really charming, but I thought maybe you had parents with a sense of humor. In any event, but Berkeley is in charge of the research that is on the things that the center has done. Sort of, right? Is that right?
I support all of our research, yes.
Yeah, and we're glad to do it. And as you all know, this Ferg today is co-sponsored with the Center for Child and Family Policy as well. Welcome to this first Ferg of the academic year, and it's my pleasure to introduce Berkeley Yorkery.
Excellent. And Greg, can you pass? Thank you, Joel. We're so glad to be co-sponsoring with you all. And thank you all for joining us. We are so fortunate to have Greg Baer, Executive Director of the Grable Foundation, with us today. Greg is a child advocate whose work is inspired by the legacy of his hero, Fred Rogers. For nearly 15 years, he has helped lead Remake Learning, a network of educators, scientists, artists, and makers he founded in 2007. Formed in Rogers' real-life neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Remake Learning has turned heads everywhere from Forbes to the World Economic Forum for its efforts to ignite children's curiosity, encourage their creativity, and foster justice and belonging in schools, libraries, museums, and more. A graduate of the University of Notre Dame and Duke University, Greg holds honorary degrees from Carlow University and St. Vincent College. He's an advisor to the Brookings Institution and the Fred Rogers Center, and has been cited by Barack Obama and the Disruptor Foundation as an innovator and thought leader. He is the co-author of a new book, When You Wonder, You're Learning, which I think everybody has a copy of, or many of you. And today he'll be sharing with us some of Mr. Rogers' enduring lessons for raising creative, curious, and caring kids. Please welcome Greg.
Well, I feel like I have come to This Is Your Duke Life. And I am super happy for that. And as Joel noted, there is a joyful anxiety about this as well. And knowing who you are, and then also what you just shared, I'm incredibly more humbled, because our time together in conversation would probably be remarkable in conversation about what we need to do for kids. And so I'm hopeful that what I share today could inspire each of us individually in our own lives, in our own homes, but also in the communities in which we're privileged to work. And if you'll forgive me, because I just want to make, do I need to point this in a certain direction?
You need to talk near to the microphone.
Is the microphone on?
Somebody just stood up and said
it's on?
I think that was during introduction. So
okay, so it's on.
Gotten better.
And Cassie, to advance.
Probably back there.
There we go. All right. So some of you know exactly who this is. And some of you might not, which is entirely okay. Fred Rogers produced and led Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood from 1968 and until 2001. And we'll come back to Fred's work, but I want to just start with a quick experiment. For those of you who know the neighborhood, think for a minute about what you felt when you watched it. And I actually just want you to shout out some words and phrases that come to mind when you think about Fred Rogers. Comfort. What was that? Warm. Love. Peace. Kindness.
Entertained.
Belonging. I love this so much. So for me, I think of hope. Hope that we as adults would protect and become the caring adults that our kids need us to be. For those of you who remember Mr. Rogers, you almost certainly remember him for the way he made you feel. Safe, accepted, special. And you might also remember his favorite number, 143, which is his way of saying, I love you. There's one letter in I, 4 letters in love, and 3 letters in you. Fred and his television program helped millions of kids feel loved. And in this slide, you're looking at 2 of them. As was noted, I'm Greg Baer. I'm the executive director of the Grable Foundation and co-founder and chair of a learning network called Remake Learning. And we'll come back to that. And with me there is Ryan Rudzeski. He's a science and education reporter and also a former elementary teacher, like many of you. We're both Western Pennsylvania kids, just like Fred himself. We were born there, we moved to different parts of the country, and eventually we found our respective ways back home. Those model homes in that opening sequence of the neighborhood that some of you remember, well, they look just like our homes. Those places to which he took us, the museums, the playgrounds, the gardens, those were our museums and our playgrounds and our gardens. Fred was a national celebrity, as you know, but he was ours. And so we had and still have an emotional connection to him that I know many of you share. Fred had this extraordinary ability to connect with kids through television. And even today, almost 20 years after his passing, his impact is still being felt. And in April, after 3 years of research and lots of drafts, we published When You Wonder You're Learning, our book about Fred's enduring lessons and why they still matter today. And along the way, we learned a few things. As we like to say, 14.3 lessons to be exact. And I think after spending some time in the neighborhood today, you'll see why we're just as wide-eyed about Fred as we were when we were kids. But maybe not for the reasons that you think. So lesson number 1. Fred Rogers was not a saint. Almost without exception, it's one of the first questions that Ryan and I are asked. Was Fred really like that? And there's always a subtext to this question, like no human being could possibly be that kind, that caring, that loving. There has to be something else at play, something mysterious, a dark side to Mr. Rogers. But the truth is that Fred was exactly who we needed him to be. Now that's different from saying he was perfect. He wasn't. But here's the thing, we didn't need him to be. What we needed instead, and what we got in Fred, was a regular guy. Someone who, despite all of the flaws that come with being a human being, committed himself to being the person that children needed every day. The Fred that we saw on the screen was not an act, but a practice, the result of Fred's daily choices and his careful methods. And as his wife, Joanne, Mrs. Rogers, wrote in the foreword of our book, no one worked harder at being Fred Rogers than did Fred Rogers himself. So who was Fred Rogers, and what was he working so hard to become? Which leads us to lesson 2, that Fred was more than a nice guy in a sweater. He was born in 1928 in the little town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, just to the east of Pittsburgh. And some of you have maybe seen a best-selling biography about Fred Rogers, maybe even saw Morgan Neville's remarkable documentary, or maybe even the biopic film starring Tom Hanks as Fred Rogers. Now, we're not going to go into those things today, but there are some things that we feel like you need to know if you want to understand the neighborhood. And the first thing is that Fred hated television. The first thing he said he ever saw was people throwing pies in each other's faces on that screen. And it upset him to see people demeaning each other like that using the technology that he knew was so attractive. But despite that initial dislike, Fred saw the technology's potential. And he decided that as he enrolled at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, that he wanted to use that technology to minister to children. And his teachers at the seminary said, well, if you're going to do that, you better learn something about child development theory and practice. And this is where the story gets quite interesting. Because it was at the Arsenal Children's Family Center that some of the world's most brilliant psychologists, pediatricians, and psychiatrists in the entire world all happened to be working at the same time. There were folks like Benjamin Spock. Some of you know that book on the left, Baby and Child Care. There was also Erik Erikson, a world-renowned psychologist. And most importantly, there was Margaret McFarland, a psychiatry professor who became Rogers' lifelong mentor and dear friend. So studying at Arsenal put Fred Rogers at the cutting edge of child development science. And he took what he learned there and blended it with puppetry and songs and stories, building what became Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Every aspect of this program, from the set to his wardrobe to the songs themselves, was grounded in science in some extraordinary ways. In many ways, Fred Rogers was a learning scientist decades ahead of his time, and it's an overlooked part of his legacy. Which leads us to lesson number 3, and that is that Fred left us the blueprints for modern learning. Today, we know more than ever about how people learn. As a field, the science of learning now includes everything from behavioral science to artificial intelligence to neuroscience, economics, and so much more. And there are people and organizations doing amazing work. Some of you work with them across this country. And we're figuring out the methods and the conditions that are most conducive to learning. And what's really fascinating about this stuff is the degree to which it validates and in fact mirrors what Fred was doing a half a century ago in Pittsburgh. Some of those papers maybe you've read from your colleagues here at Duke or from places like MIT, the University of Washington, and elsewhere about the science of learning. Well, they read just like scripts from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Take the title of our book. Did you know when you wonder you're learning? It comes from the song that you see on the left side of the screen, which I won't sing for you, but some of you are probably singing in your heads right now. And you can see it's about the value of curiosity as it relates to getting smarter. Now take a look at the right side here. This is a clip from a research paper that comes from the University of California at Davis. Essentially, it says that when you're curious, your brain starts to take in all sorts of information, whether it's the thing you started reading or learning or singing about or not. So you see, Fred Rogers was right when you wonder you are learning. Now this paper was published in 2014. Fred wrote that song in 1979. Now we could spend all day talking about the ways in which learning science is catching up to Fred Rogers. But the bottom line is this, that the neighborhood is more than a pleasant memory in the minds of us as adults. It's a blueprint, a resource that if we study it, can point the way forward for kids and for learning. And so today we're going to explore a little bit about what Fred did, how he did it, and what it can look like when caring adults use Fred's blueprints to build the learning spaces where kids can thrive. And we intentionally use this word, learning spaces, because of lesson number 4. That is, that Fred knew that learning happens everywhere. Now, so many of you are familiar with the neighborhood, so you know the sheer variety of settings where learning took place. It was in his living room, at the library, at the merry-go-round, in the music shop, in a garden, in a crayon factory, in the community, on field trips, in restaurants. The list goes on and on. The point being that Fred Rogers built a neighborhood. He knew that classrooms and schools were critically important, but he also knew that they're part of a learning landscape, a landscape in which learning happens everywhere. And part of the reason that we wrote this book is because for the last 15 years, we've been building a landscape like that in Fred Rogers' own backyard. In my corner of the world, Remake Learning is a professional network of educators in and out of school, early childhood through higher education, working together to reimagine learning. This network involves thousands of people representing more than 600 schools, museums, libraries, early learning centers, creative industries, campuses of higher education, all of whom are working together to create more engaging, relevant, and equitable learning experiences for our young people. And because Remake Learning is situated in Western Pennsylvania, we often say that the educators who are involved in Remake Learning use the Fred method, referring, of course, to Fred Rogers. But you can think about it this way. Whole child development plus learning sciences equals the Fred method. In so many ways, our book springs forth from the remarkable landscape that we call Remake Learning. Work that, as was noted, has been recognized nationally and worldwide. that's centered on the mindsets, the skills, the dispositions that we want for our learners, the work of hundreds of educators crafting a vision of a profile for a learner for young people in our region, finding ways to connect all of those places where kids learn, whether it's at a place like KidZoo or Student U or the Museum of Life Science, and finding genuine ways to create learning pathways in and out of school from their earliest years through high school and beyond. Recently, more than 1,000 educators came together to think about where does this work take us now? When we think about post-pandemic learning opportunities that will eventually come for our kids, what are going to be the building blocks for the learning environment that we create for them? You can read about so much of this and more at remakelearning.org. And it might be a place where we go into questions and answers as we think about the concrete things happening in communities like Pittsburgh, the Triangle, and elsewhere, to really apply that Fred method in profoundly important ways for today's kids. Which leads us to lesson number 5, and that is that Fred taught the tools for learning. He called the skills and mindsets he taught in the neighborhood his tools for learning. Things like curiosity, creativity, and a few others that I'll get into shortly. As Fred said, I'd rather give children the tools for learning. If we give them the tools, they'll want to learn the facts. And more importantly, they'll use the facts to build and not destroy. You see, Fred knew that academic learning had to be paired with nurturing what's best in us, that one without the other is insufficient. He knew that you needed both to raise complete human beings. And here again, of course, learning science is proving him right. Lesson number 6. Fred Rogers' tools for learning still matter today, and in some ways, they might be more important than they were 40 and 50 years ago. Scientists, parents, employers, and just about everyone else now says that Fred's tools are essential for children's success, especially in this age defined by algorithms and smart machines. And one of the most amazing examples of this comes from Google. I suspect a company we all know a little bit about. So a few years back, the company tried to figure out what makes for a good boss. And at first you could imagine that Google said, well, of course the best programmers make for the best managers. But they decided to test that assumption with something that they called Project Oxygen. And in that work, they analyzed more than 10,000 data points from things like exit interviews and employee surveys, performance reviews. And they found that technical expertise, while still important, ranked nearly last among the things that mattered most. The other more important things were things like communication, things like caring about your employees and their well-being. They wanted all of these things that Fred Rogers taught so well, these very human qualities that can't be replaced by machines. And so when we help kids develop these qualities, not only are we giving them the tools to succeed in their professional lives, we're also giving them the tools to discover themselves, to discover what intrigues them, what bothers them, what moves them, and what brings them joy. You see, Fred's tools have been shown to boost academics, health, and mental well-being. They're up to 10 times more predictive of long-term success than our test scores. And as you know, they cost almost nothing to develop, and they hinge on the very things that make life worth living: self-acceptance, close, loving relationships, and a deep regard for our neighbors. So let's dig into the 6 chapters of our book. Lesson number 7. Fred nurtured our curiosity. In 2007, a psychologist named Michelle Chouinard published a study. Some of you may know this. She had recorded 4 children at regular intervals from the time they were 14 months old until they were just older than 5. And she and her team collected more than 230 hours of recorded conversations between those kids and their parents and caregivers. And of course, the sample size was small, but what they found was revealing. When those 4 kids were left to their own devices, they asked a lot of questions, more than 100 per hour on average. Suffice to say, and as you know, kids are curious. They're inherently curious. The world is a big, mystifying, mysterious, messy place, and they want to know all about it. And we know from modern learning science that the more curious kids are, the more their learning sticks. Susan Engel, who's one of the world's leading experts on this, says this, that inciting children's curiosity is the best way to ensure that they will absorb and retain information. So you'd think that we, as adults, would make inciting curiosity one of our top priorities. But most of you probably remember from your own childhoods that that's certainly not always the case. When Engel herself studied classrooms in the field, she found that in kindergarten, in any 2-hour stretch, they'd see anywhere from 2 to 5 questions. In 5th grade, the situation was even more striking. A typical 2-hour stretch of time didn't yield 1 student question. That's 2 hours, no questions in a classroom, when we know that some kids left to their own conditions would ask 100 in an hour. So how do we bridge this gap? How do we tap and nurture the natural curiosity that kids bring? Fortunately, Fred left us some blueprints. One of the things that he learned from his mentor, Margaret McFarland, was the Quaker philosophy that attitudes are caught, not taught. He knew how important it was to model curiosity himself. And if you watch basically any episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you'll find him telling viewers how many questions he has and how much he wants to know about the world. He shows viewers that he's a learner too, and that he'll be learning with them wherever they go. It's what you bring to your children every day, Fred Rogers said. While researching our book, you can imagine we talked with any number of people, and one of them was Hedda Sharapin. Hedda is herself an educator, and she was there with Fred Rogers on the first day of production in 1968. And Hedda shares this beautiful example that we can all think about in our own lives. And it's simply called the Ask It basket. So Hedda remembers walking into a classroom and seeing a wicker basket on the teacher's front desk and thinking, well, that's curious, what is that? She sits down and observes the lesson. And she sees as the lesson goes on that kids are asking questions. It's much more than 0 per hour. It's dozens of questions. And some of them are right on point with the point of instruction, and some of them are coming out from over the left field wall. But what the teacher did is so interesting. One, she wasn't quick to answer it. She noticed the question, she acknowledges it, she takes a moment to write it down, and says later, and then puts it in the Ask It basket, and says later, we're going to wonder about this question. Now, what does that example illustrate to us? It illustrates a profound respect for the child, an acknowledgement that he or she has questions, a comfort to ask questions, a sense that you belong in that space, and this is a comfortable place where we're going to learn, and we're going to learn together, and in the presence of a caring adult. Each of us can do that. You can do that with a Tupper bowl in your kitchen. A librarian can do that with a help desk. We can do simple tactical things like the Ask It basket in the environments that we create for kids in ways that allow them to wonder. Kids have to know that it's okay to do that. And they also have to know what's out there to wonder about. And Fred knew that it's hard for kids, or really any of us for that matter, to be curious about things that are completely unfamiliar. And so that's why Fred Rogers, in the course of his work, when introducing something new to his viewers, always started with something familiar. Might have been his fish tank, it could have been a sandbox, it could have been crayons. Fred knew that curiosity doesn't spring from some sort of void, but rather something that's already known, a mystery that kids want to know something more about. So he might remind us about the crayons, something a kid knows so much about, and then take us off to a crayon factory, and then start talking about how machines work. He knew that if we started with something familiar, he could take us to all sorts of wondrous places. And he also knew that he had to protect our creativity, our next tool. So in 1968, George Land tested the creativity of 1,000 5-year-olds using a test he developed for NASA. And some of you probably know this study. At the time, he found out that 98% of the kids that took this test scored so highly that they qualified as creative geniuses. As with curiosity, kids are naturally creative. They make up stories and songs. They draw pictures and sometimes develop, as you know, curious, unusual, sometimes ingenious solutions to the problems at hand. But George Land also discovered something else. He tested that same group of 5-year-olds every few years. And at 10 years old, the share of creative geniuses fell from 98% to 30%. At 15 years old, the share fell to 12%. And by adulthood, it fell to 2%. 98% to 2%. Now, what Land and his team concluded was not that creativity naturally fades with age, but rather that non-creative behavior is learned. As we grow older and more self-conscious, and as our peers put down their paintbrushes and give up their instruments, so do many of us. We learn to become less expressive. We learn to be less open to new ideas and ways of thinking. We learn to be less innovative in our approaches to problems. And Fred himself talked about this. What happens if children hear that their mud pies are no good and their block buildings have no importance? So how do we create and protect and nurture the curiosity that kids are born with? How do we help them counter those non-creative behaviors that they'll learn as they get older? In the neighborhood, it began with us, the adults. Every day we found Fred engaged in a creative pursuit that he told us brought us joy. The sort of things that some of us might have thought of as childish. He plays with popsicle sticks. He cuts construction paper. And as he does so, he makes clear that what he's doing brings him joy. And it's not just Fred. In the neighborhood, we are introduced to countless creative geniuses. Folks on the screen like you know, Wynton Marsalis, Yo-Yo Ma, and Julia Child. But more often than not, it was the everyday characters on the show. Some of you remember Officer Clemens? Well, he was also the neighborhood opera singer. Handyman Negri, the neighborhood guitarist. All of these guest stars and all of these characters show that creativity isn't just for kids, that we don't have to give up our creative pursuits that enrich our lives. Importantly, as Fred said, the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and loves it right in front of you. Fred shared this amazing example from Margaret McFarland. She brought a world-renowned sculptor to the Arsenal Children's Center. And you can imagine the sculptor says, "What is it that you want me to do? What is it that you want me to teach the kids?" And Margaret said to the sculptor, "I want you to love the clay and love it in front of the children." Lesson number 9, Fred modeled communication. If it's one thing that set Fred apart, it was his thoughtfulness and his intention and the way in which he communicated with kids. For all of us, we talk so frequently that it feels intuitive and almost automatic, right? It's not something that we really think about unless we've done something wrong, said something wrong, something we regretted. But Fred understood that talking with kids is a unique art, one that often takes a lot of practice and a lot of reflection. In our book, we describe Fred's approach by borrowing a concept from Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, who breaks down effective communication into two components, deep listening and loving speech. So what is deep listening? It does one particular thing. It acknowledges and respects the other person's feelings, even when we don't agree with those feelings. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. Kids, like everyone else, have feelings that are downright baffling sometimes. But when we make space to listen to those feelings, without interjecting our judgment, our assumptions, our experiences, we start to do what Fred did, which is make those feelings mentionable. And as Fred liked to say, anything that's mentionable becomes manageable. Now that doesn't mean that we don't correct children or explain our position, but it does mean, at least at first, that we listen uncritically. Being supportive, Fred said, often means waiting and listening and more waiting until you're better able to understand the drama that a certain child is living through. Once we've done that waiting and that listening and waiting some more, it's also our job to speak to children lovingly. And speaking lovingly does three things. It encourages, it enriches, and it empowers human relationships. And a great tool for thinking about this comes to us from the Fred Rogers Center itself. It's called Simple Interactions, simpleinteractions.org. This was developed by Harvard professor Junlei Lee and expanded by Dr. Dana Winters at St. Vincent College. It's a way to think about our daily interactions with kids and whether our daily interactions convey that sense of love and support that they need. Early childhood educators all across America are now using this tool to continuously improve their craft as they support the kids in their care. Lesson number 10. Fred showed us how neighbors work together. Our next tool is collaboration. Today, 9 out of 10 of us work together in teams. To say nothing of our families, our communities, all the other places where we have to work together. And we know all too well that this doesn't come easy. Happily, there's a tool out there that can help teach kids to collaborate. And of course, it comes to us in Fred's blueprints. In the early 1970s, a psychologist named Lynette Frieder-Kofer found that when kids watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and when they did so with a caring adult who could elaborate on its themes, something interesting happened. Compared to their peers, Kids who watched the neighborhood grew more patient, more willing to wait their turn, more sympathetic to each other's feelings, and more cooperative. The key, she wrote, was that Fred's neighborhood was a small civil society, one where characters learned to bridge their differences and pursue shared goals. So let's go back to Google. I don't go back to Google because it's some sort of perfect example. Rather, it's like the crayon. It's familiar to each of us. So in 2012, the company analyzed its own teams, trying to figure out why some teams worked and others didn't, even when those teams shared some of the same people. And the company found that the teams that lacked psychological safety missed their sales goals on average by 19%. And those on teams that where individual members felt psychologically safe, well, they exceeded their sales goals by about the same amount. In other words, problems get solved when everyone feels safe. And learning science has proven again and again the importance of this psychological safety and mutual respect, and how it powers effective collaboration. So how do we create environments like this, where kids can practice what it means to collaborate? Well, let me return again to another place that we visited in the course of our research, the Girls of Steel. It's an all-high school robotics team in Pittsburgh. Girls coming from many high schools, not knowing one another. And they do, in their work, exactly what Fred Rogers did in the neighborhood. They practice teamwork. The girls' coaches create these fictional scenarios drawn from real situations that the girls themselves are dealing with. And as a team, they then hypothetically walk through how they'd handle it. And in that practice, you can imagine how they're practicing interpersonal conflict. They're practicing perspective taking. They recognize that they're going to stumble over each other en route to their common ground. But by talking about this in a fictionalized, judgment-free way, they start to develop the psychological safety that allows them as individuals, as in a team, to work together in the robotics goals that they have. Lesson number 11. Fred tried, failed, practiced, and improved. He also brought us along for the ride. You see, Fred understood that the process of learning was just as important as the outcome. He showed us the value not just of mastery, but of growth, of discovering a skill that interests you, and maybe really being bad at it for a while, and making lots of mistakes, and then seeing those mistakes as opportunities to get better, and eventually feeling that thrill that we all feel when we have that moment of great discovery. You see, how many of you ever walked into a classroom only to be told that no one ever gets an A? No one's going to get an A in my classroom. How many of you ever been told, well, so-and-so is a natural? Left to wonder, well, what does that make me? You see, it's hard to love learning if the adults around you insist that in so many ways you're not enough. Or if they use your mistakes as a basis for judgment rather than markers on some sort of road to improvement. And while it's true that tough love tactics might mean well and might inspire hard work, they also push promising young people away. And the consequences aren't just harmful. They're more harmful to some kids than to others. One study found that when 6 and 7-year-olds were shown a game for really smart kids, girls showed less interest than boys. Now, when we talk about talent or intelligence in some sort of fixed state, something you have or don't have, we inevitably tell some kids that they don't have promise. And we tell a whole lot more that they really don't have promise. So you see, Fred took the opposite tact in the neighborhood. Everyone we meet, from Fred himself to the athletes and the artists and the other elite characters whom we meet, they talk openly about their struggles. And Fred celebrates all of their accomplishments and spends a whole lot more time talking about their process and mistakes and the growth. You see, as Fred said, life is marked by failures and setbacks and slip-ups as much as by hard-won satisfactions and sudden discoveries of unexpected strength. I suspect everyone in this room knows that term growth mindset. Carol Dweck, a professor at Stanford University, calls growth mindset the belief that your basic qualities are things that you can cultivate through your efforts, your strategies, and help from others. Now, while growth mindset isn't a panacea, it is, under the right conditions, something that can help accomplish some pretty amazing things for kids. You see that game for really smart kids? You see, when the researchers changed it and described it as being a game for kids who try really hard, girls were every bit as interested as the boys. Tools that teach kids that their intelligence is malleable matter. But this is important. It really only works when the adults believe that too. Growth mindset has to be coupled with that sense that adults around them truly believe that they're capable of learning. And when adults convey that belief, the kids find it to be authentic, trustworthy, and actionable. So how do we do that? Unfortunately, there aren't any shortcuts to this, and it really requires connection. It requires building relationships. As Fred liked to say, there are so many ways of learning things. And do you know what the best way is? To have someone you love help you. Which leads us to lesson 12, that Fred showed us were worth being proud of. So let's talk about that last tool for learning, about building connection, about becoming that somebody for children. In the early 1970s, Hallmark, the greeting card company, invited celebrities to design a Christmas display in their Manhattan store. And some of you I know were around for that era. So you could imagine how garish and over the top and, quite frankly, today embarrassing those displays might have looked. But one display was different. It was a single pine tree about the height of a child, encased in clear acrylic. It had no lights, no tinsel, no ornaments. It didn't even say who designed it. There was only a plaque that said, "I like you, just the way you are." Of course, we know who the designer was. If there was one message at the core of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, it was this. And though we don't always think about feeling as accepted as a basic human need, those feelings matter as much as food and water. And not only does our well-being depend on human relationships, so too does our capacity for learning. And there are all sorts of studies about this, but I'll share just one. In 2002, a group of researchers gave some college students a fake personality test and assigned them to groups based on their supposed results. They told one group that they'd have all sorts of rewarding relationships in their lives. They told a second group that they wouldn't have those relationships, that their marriages would end and they would feel alone and sad. I know, can you imagine this study being done today? And they told the third group, you are going to be accident prone. Car accidents, falling downstairs, all sorts of terrible things. The researchers then gave each of these three groups an IQ test. And the only group that bombed the IQ test was that group that had been told they'd been rejected. Even that accident group didn't seem to be affected at all. So the researchers concluded that it wasn't bad news in general that it caused a drop in the test scores, but rather the prospect of social exclusion. When confronted with this horrific idea of spending their lives alone, students lost the ability to think, to reason clearly, to learn. Now, I will tell you, fortunately, researchers apologized to everyone afterwards, told them it had all been a ruse, but it underscores the importance of Fred's message of radical acceptance. Fred knew that we all need the same thing. Whether we're a preschooler or a young teen, a graduating college senior or retired person, we human beings all want to know that we're acceptable and that our being alive somehow makes a difference in the lives of others. That knowledge is more than a nice feeling. I like you just the way you are. Kids and adults have to know that they matter to the people around them, that they're worth being proud of. And we can show kids that in lots of ways. Yes, by telling them, but also by deploying all of the tools that Fred taught us, by nurturing their creativity, by protecting their curiosity, by listening deeply and speaking lovingly, by building psychologically safe spaces and seeing their promise and believing in their potential. Now, showing kids that we like them just the way they are doesn't mean that we tell them that they're perfect or that everything that they think and do is great or even okay. But what it does mean is that we refuse to reject their humanity with all of humanity's joys and all of humanity's flaws and all of humanity's potential. Fred used to like to say that love is an active noun, like the word struggle. That to love someone is to struggle to accept them exactly as he or she is right now. It's not always easy, but as adults, it's the single most important gift that we can give. And all of us can do a version of what Fred did. A reporter once asked Fred, "What is the neighborhood? What is it that you're creating here?" And when Fred answered, he didn't call it a television program. Instead, he called it an atmosphere, one that allows people to be comfortable enough to be who they are. All of us have a role in creating that atmosphere. And that's why Fred left us his blueprints. The truth of Fred's ministry, Joanne Rogers wrote, was that every last one of us can be as caring, kind, and influential in children's lives as he was. That's why back in Fred's own neighborhoods, we're investing so very deeply in relationships. Relationships among the caring adults and the caring professions. People just like you, teachers and librarians and early childhood educators and artists and technologists, parents and beyond, to create that atmosphere that learning science tells us is necessary for great learning. Lesson 14. The greatest thing we can do is let people know that they are loved and capable of loving. Now, this is a quote of Fred's, and really there's not much else that I can say except to add a little, to read this exactly as Fred wrote it. From the time you were very little, you've had people who smiled you into smiling, people who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. Some of them may be here right now. Some of them may be far away. Some of them may even be in heaven. But wherever they are, if they've loved you and encouraged you and wanted what was best in life for you, they're right inside yourself. And I feel you deserve quiet time on this special occasion to devote some thought to them. So let's just take 1 minute in honor of those who have cared about us along the way. 1 silent minute. I'll watch the clock. Lesson 14.3, I love you. So what can you do to show your love, to share your love, to spread your love for learning? Around the turn of the millennium, Fred issued us this challenge. Try your best to make goodness attractive, he said. That's one of the toughest assignments you'll ever be given. And Fred is right, it is tough. It is easier to tear down than it is to build. It is easier to fear than it is to love. It is easier to criticize than it is to create. But if we want to do more than just prepare future workers, if we want every child to have the freedom to discover her potential, if we want to raise creative, curious, caring kids, if we want to build stronger, more inclusive, more just communities and a loving world, then making goodness attractive is what we have to do. And whomever it is that you've been thinking about, whether it's a parent, a teacher, a friend, or maybe even Fred himself, he or she is proof that making goodness attractive is possible. So how will we do the same for our kids? Thank you.
Okay, floor is now open for comments and questions and criticisms and anything else.
I'm on the hot seat.
Oh, you're exactly right. Okay, former teacher.
Not in elementary school. So that was really interesting. So thank you. The comment I want to make relates to some research I did recently with a couple of philosophers. And we were very critical, and are very critical, of the whole test-based mentality. I mean, how could we be forcing our kids to take tests and say, evaluate them based on the test? And we came up with a notion that we refer to as educational goods. And I'm not going to go into that now. That's all about the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and dispositions that allow people to flourish. But along with that, we introduced the term childhood quiz. And so we were talking about schooling. And it's not enough to think about what children are going to be like when they're adults. we wanted them to be able to play and wonder and be creative when they were children. And I didn't know we were building on all the things you taught us.
Well, this is, Fred, as I said, Fred built a neighborhood. And there's great work happening, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, advancing their Learning Happens Everywhere initiative, or other work by other organizations across this country recognizing that there's a learning landscape for kids. Yes, schools are critically important, and yes, maybe in those schools tests are, have a role to play in part. But kids spend only 14 to 20% of their waking hour in a school building. And what is the work that we in communities then can do to capture all of those other waking hours in constructive ways that tap into the passions and interests of kids and light them up in ways that respond to what the learning science tells us we need to do. And it's why in places like Pittsburgh, here in the Triangle and elsewhere, there's more and more work happening to connect in serious ways, whether it's through badging or credentialing or professional development, or more likely the layers of those and other things, to create genuine learning environments that capture that sensibility about the neighborhood. And how critical that is for kids, because they're going to find the outlets that support them in their learning. And as we all know, when they start to get passionate about it, all those other things that are important are going to start to stick for them.
Can I just follow up on that? You said those are all the things that happen in the neighborhood, and I'm saying schools should do that as well. That we should let kids play in school and be curious.
And we see discrete examples, probably too few, but we see elementary schools as they start to think about personalized learning in ways that take advantage of project-based learning and redesign of learning spaces, reintegrating Montessori methods, something so familiar certainly in the early childhood space, reintroducing that into public elementary education settings. Another person we talked to in the book is Bill Strickland, who created the Manchester Craftsmen's Guild in Pittsburgh. Harvard Business School has written 3 case studies, I think, about Manchester Craftsmen's Guild, and it's been replicated elsewhere. Bill worked closely with Fred Rogers, and Bill says something so clearly: environment drives behavior. And it's why support for things like STEM labs and STEAM labs and maker spaces and entertainment technology center-like spaces in schools and all of these other environments are so critical, because those environments affect the behavior then of the adults and the kids and the type of instruction and learning that happens in those spaces.
Hi, Greg. I am curious. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of conversations about how the disruption to public education was creating a moment for us to imagine how we educate young people. As someone who has spent so much time thinking about creating the conditions that allow young people to learn, in what ways are you excited or seeing spaces that are leading into the opportunity for reimagination of schools that align with the philosophies that you taught us today from Mr. Rogers? I think I might be one of the few people who actually never watched Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood because I grew up somewhere else. I was in my homework. And in what ways might you be concerned about a potential missed opportunity to create those conditions that we were also hopeful for at the beginning?
So let's turn to schools themselves, because I'm in the camp that unless we realize genuine systemic changes in the next 2 to 3 years, we're not going to realize them. We have this incredible moment right now to build on the accelerated experience that schools that they had during these past few years, the empathy that was built up, at least in the first part of the pandemic, among parents, families, and caregivers, among teachers, and what happened. And it's something that we tried to pay attention to early in the pandemic. So in the first summer, it's hard in COVID time. So in the first summer of COVID, we pulled together a regional commission on the future of learning and ultimately published a piece about the post-pandemic learning opportunities. And in the course of that, tried to identify very specific things. That work then continued this past year, working very closely with the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And there were more than 1,000 administrators from across Pennsylvania who came together to identify those building blocks for the future that we want to realize. And you could imagine there was a whole lot more than the visual that I showed you very briefly. But again, we tried to identify very concrete things. As one example, what if every school building had a director of relationships? Not a counselor, not someone to replace counselors, and we quite frankly need more counselors. Not teachers, and let teachers continue to do all of the things that they do as active or silent mentors. But actually someone who wakes up 24/7 and does nothing more than think about the social capital of students, the experiences that she or he doesn't have and that they might have, and really invest in the relationship building that we know is at the core of any great learning. You know, it's not such a far-fetched idea. 10 years ago, there weren't directors of instructional innovations in our school, and now it's sort of normal to have such a position. Well, what if 10 years from now, schools actually had directors of relationships? It's just one example. So we think about how we deploy people differently. We think about how we design spaces differently. We think about how we use assessment differently. There are genuine opportunities, but we've got to capture this moment, or it'll be fleeting.
Yeah, I made a connection here today. I just want to thank you for it because I am a long-time fan of Mr. Rogers. I'm also a huge fangirl of public school teachers. And I think I made a connection with listening to you talk, and I really appreciate you lifting up all those lessons because I can't think of one of these lessons that any public educator wouldn't agree with. But the connection I made just now, and I was wondering if you could comment on this, is that, so Fred famously had to advocate for funding. So I'm sure you're all familiar, yeah. Okay.
That great clip.
And we believed him. You know, the senator was like, you just got yourself $20 million, if I'm not mistaken. I feel like with No Child Left Behind, and you can jump in if you think historically I'm off there, we stopped believing public educators. And I think in a sense we stopped believing, I feel like we stopped believing Fred. You know, so I feel like, I'm wondering if that's also like a piece of the puzzle. It's like not, they want to do this, but we're kind of not believing them the way that we believe Fred. I mean, all Fred had to do was like explain it to us, and we believed him. But I don't think that's the case so much anymore.
You might be right. And it's in fact why in the course of the work that we've done in southwestern Pennsylvania with Remake Learning that we've invested so significantly in what we'll describe as public will building campaigns. Extensive audio campaigns, media campaigns, articles, videos, and the like. All of it designed to affect the public narrative about great learning in our public schools, respect for our schools, and tying it to something emotional like Fred Rogers, which is easy in Western Pennsylvania because Fred Rogers is a Western Pennsylvania icon, if not obviously an American icon. And it's emotion, ultimately, not data, evidence, everything else that drives policy, ultimately. And so we feel like that emotion of the Fred Rogers story and talking about the Fred Rogers method is so critically important. And some of the recent data that Brookings just published last week, in fact, having surveyed 20,000 teachers and parents in 12 jurisdictions around the world, including Western Pennsylvania, the data is suggesting that Western Pennsylvania is standing out in a slightly different way, askew from other places, certainly in the United States. And we're hopeful that some of the work that we've done, although we can't draw a line from A to B, captures exactly what you've just described.
Great, thanks very much. That was a really fascinating presentation. And you've described a lot of principles, and you've done you've induced a number of principles that he's followed. I'm wondering, how conscious was he that he was following these kinds of principles and using these methods, which you, of course, did very interestingly related to cognitive science now? Yeah. Or was this something that he did? And did he talk at all in terms of the principles of what he was doing? Or, again, was it just sort of like the guy who discovered, he says, I was shocked to discover that I've been speaking prose all my life?
So, Ted, this is a great question. And the truth is, he was incredibly intentional. He reviewed those scripts closely, weekly, with Margaret McFarland. He worked with other child development psychologists and pediatricians at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh and the University of Pittsburgh. The thing is, he made it so seamless and made it so simple and approachable that we overlook the very scientific approach that he took to his work. And so we remember that man in a cardigan, but we don't remember him or see him as a learning engineer, as a learning scientist.
Could he have given this talk about himself?
I don't know that he was so. I had the privilege of knowing Fred Rogers. He wouldn't have told the story about himself in that way. He didn't direct the spotlight on him, which is partly why we feel it's so important to reframe his legacy in part. But he knew he was doing all these things.
So this may be a big but little, a big but little, a big but little question. The little question is a difference without a distinction. But I'm curious about your use of the word tools for learning.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of tools, I'm going to build a house, and the tool is a hammer. The tool is not the builder, it's a hammer. And it seems to me that what you're talking about is the teacher is the tool. Who she or he is, as compared with putting something in their hands. And so Carol Dweck would talk about mindset.
Mm-hmm.
And are these, you could frame this as 14 tools to develop the right kind of learning environment, or 14 components of a teacher's mindset that a teacher might move towards to become that kind of person?
So Tony, we use that tools for learning phrase because that comes from Fred himself. I actually prefer that word that he used, atmosphere, right? The atmosphere for learning that we create. It's incredible when you think back to the nearly 1,000 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, all very intentionally and deliberately designed. There's no moment that Fred is teaching us fractions or conjugating verbs or doing anything of the sort. Rather, it's always about the context in which learning takes place, the sense of belonging, the sense of creating wonder. It's about the culture and the atmosphere that we as adults create for them that he recognizes will then motivate and prompt questions and agency among the learners themselves.
And the role of the teacher in creating that context.
Absolutely. You know, it's interesting when you look, have any of you seen the animated version today, Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood? Some of you. You know, the interesting thing about Daniel Tiger's Neighborhood, if you take a look, 3/4 of the characters are adults. You know, we think about Daniel Tiger and all of his friends, but it's actually a program filled with adults because of the role of the caring adult in the children's lives and the atmosphere for learning and the tools for learning that they're employing to prompt learning.
Let me sneak in one more quick question.
Yes.
Does this apply to teaching new students?
Absolutely, 1,000%.
Is this only for elementary schools?
I think this is, yeah, you know, that example, the Ask It Basket, we didn't actually ask Hedda whether it came from a first grade classroom or an 11th grade classroom. And I like to think that it comes from an 11th grade classroom because the learning science that you all, some of you know better than I do, that you would read from MIT and elsewhere, it applies as much on a campus like this as it does at the W.G. Pearson building in Durham or in Duke Gardens. Adme.
Thank you. I'll hand it on. I'm so glad that the question turned to whether you could apply it here, Greg, as somebody who's still teaching in the same program from which you graduated here in Cobb Hall. And I guess I have two questions to ask, particularly about the tools that you put forward for us in generating this atmosphere. So one of them is creativity and protecting creativity. Another one was communication, being deeply about listening. And I've started to use a framework called the quadruple A framework, which is appreciate, analyze, act, and be accountable. And as I've been using this framework, my students are asking difficult questions, which I'm glad, because now I know asking questions, excellent, many questions an hour. Right? Not that I didn't know that. But the two questions are this, right? One is, Adme, when you ask for creativity in your assignments, what do you mean by creativity? Does it have to be somebody who's an artist? And I noticed the pictures you had were musicians and, Julia Child, who's a food artist, if you will, right? But like, what do you have to do to be creative? What is the threshold? What are the kinds of things that count as creativity? Can you be creative as a teacher where you're not making anything, right? Other than the conditions in which people learn. How do you describe creative beyond just pictures of people who are musicians and good food makers, right? That's the first question. Second question is, this question about deep listening, I really, really resonated with the way you explained that as listen first without criticizing, without a critical mind, without judging. And if there's anything that's true about the atmosphere in higher education, I think the number one thing that we're supposed to teach our students is critical thinking, right? And so that's really running against the grain of what it is that people believe is the number one task of a professor at Duke. And so I always say there's a connection between appreciate, which is to listen, and like really try to understand without argument, without taking anything apart, like just to appreciate, respect, whatever this is. And then the second move is analyze. And that's where you add the critical thinking. And my students say, this is too paradoxical, right? How do I do these two things? When on the one hand, I'm supposed to appreciate without criticism, and then I'm supposed to move to this criticism because the person who you're deeply listening to knows you're going to move to that second stage and is going to feel that accepted when they know that you're going to add later on the judgment piece. So these are hard questions. What counts as creative? How would you describe it? And then how do you deal with the paradox of moving from deep listening to critical thinking?
Charlie, do we have time for a thesis?
I remember you did decision science.
So, yes, I did show that visual of Yo-Yo Ma and Julia Child, but it's also why I like raising the example of Officer Clemens and Joe Negri and the other people on the show, because we each have creative pursuits, right? And they come out in all sorts of ways. The key thing in Fred Rogers' atmosphere is demonstrating the joy that they bring us. So if I start playing the guitar in front of my kids, it doesn't matter whether or not I'm as good as Joe Negri is, right? It's actually just me tinkering. It's me playing. And it's me demonstrating, as Fred Rogers did, that it's bringing me joy. You know, I think about that first month of the pandemic. I walked into my garage, which I acknowledge looks like a scene from the TV show Hoarders. And I found my old skateboard, my Madrid skateboard. I hadn't been on that skateboard in 35 years. Why I still have it, I don't know. But it brought me joy, right? I was a skateboarding enthusiast as a little kid. And I got that skateboard out, Adme, and I just started going down the incline of the hill that's right in front of my house. What I didn't notice is that my two daughters and their 6 friends were like running behind. And you can imagine I was like laughing, giggling, because I hadn't been on a skateboard in all sorts of years and I hadn't put on a helmet. I was thinking, oh, I'm going to kill myself going down this hill. Do you know that today, that the 8 girls in my neighborhood that my daughters are friends with, they all skateboard. Now, again, I can't draw a line from A to B, but I'm pretty sure what happened that day. They noticed an adult tinkering with something that he loved at one point in his life. They saw the joy it brought me, and it provoked them to say, like, well, that's cute. I want to try that. So to me, creativity isn't the expertise. It's not the accomplishment. It's that process of learning about which Fred taught and demonstrating that it brings me joy, whether it's baking cookies, sewing a quilt, or jumping on my Madrid skateboard. To your second question, when I think about deep listening, and this is something I struggle with myself, right? Because you can imagine how writing a book like this really challenges you and causes you to second and triple guess what you're doing in your own household with your daughters, right? It's really understanding as Fred would say, understanding the drama in a child's life. But that would be true for any learner. It could be us talking right now. It's genuinely listening so that you might understand the layers and the drama that someone might be experiencing, and resisting that urge to critique or to be self-critiquing as that person is speaking, to jump in with the answer, to jump in with, oh, I had that experience, but to, as Thich Nhat Hanh would say, right, genuine listening, and as Fred would say, understanding that drama. And so in that sense, to me, it's not a paradox, it's a pause. Is that responsive?
Yes, thank you.
Good job.
I've been out of teaching for a while, but I used to work with teachers, being a faculty, and I don't remember ever assigning a book similar to this in our teaching. I think of what we teachers learn, and I think that we did not teach, or first of all, this kind of thing is not even facilitated in a teaching setting. You know, we don't even have teachers of teachers, you know, kind of showing them how this can be done as a model. And that's really important, because I think sometimes you have to model this before other people can understand it as well. And I wonder, you know, I'm thinking of a first-year teacher and thinking, oh my God, can I do this? Can I do that? And it's not until maybe 3 years later that you're thinking, oh, this kid needs this instead of that.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm saying it takes a while, and how do you get this to happen sooner, and how do you teach this in a teaching situation over teachers? Because I think that's really important, because somebody has to model it to you so that you can model it to the children. In a school setting as well. How many principals do this in allowing teachers to be creative and create? You know what I'm saying?
I 1000% agree with you. I co-chair Remake Learning with Valerie Kinlock. Valerie is the dean at the School of Education at the University of Pittsburgh. And we have this conversation all the time. And in fact, over the past number of years, we have this consortium of deans of regional schools of education that we've brought together. And it's true for schools of education in our region and across this country what an incredible shortcoming it is to have any serious and substantial attention to child development theory and practice that's informed by today's learning sciences. It's why Fred's story is so extraordinary. I mean, on one hand, it is a Mount Rushmore of folks with whom he happened to study. There was a great accident that Benjamin Spock and Margaret McFarland and Eric Erickson and others, Brazelton and others, would be either in Pittsburgh or, you know, in and out of Pittsburgh during that period of time. And he took everything that he learned, and Ted was intentional and deliberate about applying it in the most seamless ways possible. That substantial approach to child development theory and practice, quite frankly, is absent in most schools of education. It's why it's exciting what's happening in Arizona State and other places where there's, I think, new attention to the work that they need to do, integrating all that we're learning from the learning sciences that incredibly validates what Fred was doing 50 years ago.
Greg, I'm curious about your reflections on your law school experiences, because it strikes me that the law school neighborhood is just about the polar opposite of Mr. Rutgers. From the 1L experience of rigorous Socratic method, which is designed to show you that you know nothing and that all your assumptions are wrong. But even beyond that, you mostly study cases in law school, and the case wouldn't even exist if the litigants hadn't been so disagreeable that they couldn't settle in any way other than going to court. So I just wonder what you think about all that. Is this mostly a useful source of negative examples of what not to do and how not to go about it? Or are you able to make something more constructive out of that experience?
Is there a lot of loving kindness in law school? Yes. The answer to that, surprisingly, is yes. And I don't say this because you're sitting in front of me. I think about sitting in your class and taking a course about tax-exempt law. And for me, that was an interest of mine because I knew I was committed to public service. I cared about the nonprofit sector and civil society. And you created a space that was comfortable for me at a time when I was, quite frankly, struggling in law school and questioning whether it was the right choices, the right choice for me as I thought about what the future years might hold. Add may I think about the clinical experiences that I had. That's great clinical experiences like you and others provided in that law school. I think of your clinic, the death penalty clinic in which I was enrolled. Serious project-based learning that was relevant, that was engaging, that was precisely the type of experiential learning that we want for kids in our schools, in our early learning centers, in our after-school programs, and using that interest that I might have in tax-exempt issues, as obscure and niche as that might be, and how that became a springboard for general interest in tax law and other things that I didn't know that I might care about, but did. And I would say, surprisingly, maybe the answer is different. When I think about my great law school experiences and the ones that I remember and hold, they in fact applied the Fred method in some really important ways.
So I went to law school as well, and the institution might not be designed to be a loving, caring place. In full disclosure, I met my wife there, so I'm a big fan of even in institutions that don't feel like they're caring, you can find this Fred Rogers vibe, right? I mean, some of my best friends were law students that I met there who were struggling with the same stuff. And so I guess what I'm saying is it might not be the institutions that need the saving, maybe it is, but there's always the opportunity to have this happen, even in the most uncaring of environments.
You've come from Los Angeles.
Yeah, thanks. So this is really great. I enjoyed the presentation. It certainly made a compelling case for why these things are important and the impact they can have. My question is related to the role philanthropy can play to kind of capitalize on this moment. You said that it's like 2 to 3 years before we have to kind of use the moment to have sustained change. I was excited to hear that you were working with the Pennsylvania Department of Education, as they can be key in scaling, but as it relates to some of these building blocks and kind of getting them tested and piloted and scaling, I'm just kind of wondering what you see as happening with philanthropy at the table, what they are doing or what you think they should be.
I'll give you a very concrete example that comes directly from the Grable Foundation and the work that we've been doing the past couple months. So on the heels of that co-publication among the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Remake Learning, and Knowledge Works out of Cincinnati, publishing that piece, What Comes Next. I also had the privilege of serving on the National Commission for AASA's recent work on the Learning 2025 Commission, which put forward it's more than an aspirational piece, but we'll call it an aspirational piece about what equity-focused, future-focused, learning-centered learning might look like in our public schools. And so at the foundation, we took the opportunity to say, what if we took a bet with philanthropic dollars? Which school leaders, which school districts in our region would want to come together in a peer cohort to work together, taking advantage of these opportunities published by these 2 regional and state and national entities, these 2 publications, and actually deploy new ideas, new approaches in their school districts over the coming years, and really committing teams of administrators with school board support in the 2 to 3 year process that Learning 2025 advances. So what we did at the Grable Foundation is we said to school districts all across the region, one will subsidize your fee to AASA to participate in Learning 2025, which opens up all sorts of opportunities in terms of webinars, personal consultations with superintendents from across the country, chances to attend conferences and the like. 2, we'll pull together then a regional cohort and then support this group of school districts, which ultimately 31 school districts in our region came together. So 31 school districts representing 85,000 kids, about 45,000 of whom qualify for free and reduced price lunches. So funding to support a regional cohort that supplements what's happening with AASA nationally, and bringing in all sorts of experts, storytellers, strategic consultants, and others. And ideally, in a month's time, our trustees will make available a significant amount of money for grant making specifically to these 31 school districts, essentially unrestricted dollars for them to experiment over the next year or 2 with opportunities that are arising because of the processes in which they're engaged and their engagement with both PDE and AASA at the national level. So that's an example, I hope, of what, in this case, regional philanthropy can do to support some what we hope is world-class thinking on the part of school districts in places like New Brighton, Pennsylvania, Fort Cherry, Pennsylvania, Newcastle, Pennsylvania, Duquesne, Pennsylvania, little towns maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't heard of, but in the places where kids live. And it's urban, it's rural, it's suburban, it's red and blue, it's remarkably mixed. And we feel like if we give the support and also some discretion and a sense of belonging to these districts, that we might realize some systemic changes in their districts, and then collectively, 31 of them, how that becomes a lighthouse for the region and for school districts in our region, and then also instruction for PD, or Pennsylvania Department of Education, about what they might do.
Well, our time is gone, and I'm sorry to close, but that's, everybody, I don't want to overly impose on your time. In any event, I think we all sense how exciting this has been. The fact that Greg is one of our prize students that many of you have taught helps a lot. But even those of you who have not taught him get some sense of what the experience of teaching him might have been, and with varying kinds of consequences. All I can say is that this is an absolutely galvanizing moment. You just did a terrific job. But it's wonderful to have you here, Greg. I think you can see how inspired and proud all of these people who had some dealings with you and helped shape your career feel about you. And you've certainly lived up to those expectations marvelously. So thank you.